Hello and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So this week I wanted to show you a super simple art journaling page. This page has some color on it. This is actually from a page I had done in January, I'm Feeling Blue, where the sprays that I put on the paper, being watercolor paper, had seeped through to the other side. And because it has now seeped through to the other side, I decided to use that as the basis of my background. As well, I'm going to be using some embossing ink and embossing powders through Stencils. And I'm going to finish it off with some fun bird stamps. So let's get started on today's project. So to start with, I have some samples of embossing powders that I actually have. A lot of them are these Seth Apter powders. They have a lot of different substrates in them, so they're not just a solid embossing powder. They have little chunks, and they have some flock in them, and some of them have little metal meltable things in them, and so they're all very different. Like, this is vintage beeswax, and you can see it has a lot of chunkiness and different things in it that make it a really interesting product to use. So again, the color of the embossing powder, it looks a little bit different once it's melted. So I actually have this book that's my sample book that I actually do all of my samples in, so I am able to have a really good reference when I'm starting these projects. So I am going to probably choose the hammered metal, and I'm thinking I might actually blend a few embossing powders this time just to see kind of what kind of effects I can get. I'm thinking probably these two, but I will see as I go along what I end up choosing. So the first thing I use on today's project is this Embossed Dabber. It's clear embossing ink by Ranger, and it actually comes in a bottle and has a sponge on top. I know that Tim Holtz has come up with a new version of this year, and if you haven't bought any, I would suggest getting his new version. I think he uses a non-sponge applicator. It's a slightly different applicator. I guess for him it works better, and to be honest, I would probably use whatever he recommends because he does know his products very, very well. So to start with, you want to use your embossing dabber and you want to pounce it on the surface of your paper. So when you are using embossing ink, you want to move in an up and down motion to get an even coat. With embossing ink, if you just drag it across the stencil, some of the ink is going to end up underneath the stencil, and that's not going to give you a really crisp image. For this project, I want a heavier layer of embossing ink. Usually on projects where I use embossing ink, I usually use an embossing ink pad and a foam sponge. And that's usually really great when you're doing these thin layers of embossing powder. But because this embossing powder has large chunks and it is a lot more dimensional, you do need to use a lot more embossing ink to get the job done and for the larger pieces to stick to the paper. So if you're running into issues with the embossing ink not coming out of the applicator quite as much, on this particular applicator, there's actually a small valve underneath the sponge. And when you actually put your finger on the sponge, you will feel that valve. And by actually pressing that valve, it will start letting out a little bit more embossing ink so that you end up getting a little bit more flow. So if your embossing ink is a little bit older like mine is, it's not a bad thing to do just to try to make sure that you're getting equal coverage on your project. Just going to add a few more random spots. So the next step I'm going to do is actually put my art journal in a pizza box or some other sort of box. I find embossing powder is very messy, and I do try to capture what I can to put back in the bottle, but it's really good to have a box to work in just to try to keep the mess down. So I'm going to start with some of this hammered embossing powder. I'm going to collect what I can on the page, on this piece of paper, so I can put it back in. And then you want to pour what's remaining, the Managed Kitchen, the sheet, back into the container. And this is why you want to use a box, because it keeps the mess down quite a bit. And then that was the hammered metal. And now I'm going to use some of this aged marine embossing powder as well. Again, put on liberally. This stuff is chunkier, which is again why you want to use that dabber over some of the other possibilities for applying embossing ink. So now that you have this back in the box, you next want to heat up your embossing gun and melt the stuff. So here you'll see the combination of the two embossing powders, again with the blue and the black and some of it mixing. It's not a perfect stencil mark, but that wasn't really the point in what I was doing. I wanted kind of a block of color and I wanted some pattern to it, and I liked the variation from the different embossing powders, so that's what I was looking for in this particular design. So the next thing I'm going to do is actually work on my little bird stamps. I am using some of this Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock from Crafter's Companion. You can really use any sort of smooth cardstock on this. So the next thing I'm going to do is stamp the birds, and I have these crazy bird stamps from Tim Holtz, my Cezanne Jet Black ink pad, and a stamping block. And basically I'm just going to add some ink to these and stamp them. The reason I'm using Cezanne is I'm actually going to be using watercolor paint to finish this off, and the Cezanne ink ensures that I end up with a image that will not bleed. Cezanne ink is supposed to be used on pretty much any surface. I do a couple of each bird. I find sometimes I like to paint both and then see what kind of comes of it and which one I like the most. Okay. I'm using my pipette to wet all my watercolor paints. This just speeds up the process for me, and it does a little less wear and tear on my brushes as well. This way, if I want to work with a fine brush, I don't have to mix the paint. The paint is already fairly mixed, and it does help with wear and tear, especially on the small brushes. The larger brushes, it's not as much of a big deal. They can take it a little bit more, but the small brushes, you have to be a little bit more careful because the hairs are so fine. And there's two ways you can do this. You can do this wet on wet, so you can just throw a bunch of water on top and then add color, or you can just add the color a little bit at a time. So once you've added the water, then you can start actually adding in some of the paint. You notice as soon as the paint touches the wet surface, it will bloom out. And that's the beauty of using a wet on wet technique with watercolor paper. Watercolor paper is a much better choice for this. In this case, because we're using cardstock, you're not seeing the paint move nearly as much as it usually would. And that leaves for a less than an optimal result, but for what we're doing here, it works. The intention was to make sure that you got a really good stamped image. And the problem with cold pressed watercolor paper, it has a very bumpy surface, and with that bumpy surface you run into issues with not getting a really good stamped image. It is a bit of a cheaper paper than the hot press watercolor paper, and it absorbs paint well, but it does not allow for as clear of an image. Hot press watercolor paper, on the other hand, is really the best to be used with stamp images. It has a smoother surface, which is good for stamping, but doesn't absorb as much water as the cold press. It's also not the most inexpensive paper. It's actually, I would consider it fairly expensive. It's about $12 a sheet, but those sheets are about 24 to 36 inches. I think I saw a sheaf of hot press watercolor paper at the art store for about $35. So again, if you use it a lot, it's probably worth actually getting a sheaf of it. But in my case, because I don't use it as much, I try to stick with some of the larger sheets and cut them down to the sizes that I need. But in this case, because this is being used in my journal and I want some color on it, but I'm not as concerned about having it have absolutely perfect color in my images, because of that, I'm just using regular cardstock. It works well enough for what I'm doing. As well, you could also use markers with this to be able to give it a similar look. Again, there's more than one medium you can use. I'm just working a lot more on my painting skills lately, which is why I usually tend to use watercolor on these projects. So for the actual painting of this little bluebird, I am adding in blue paint, and you'll notice that the areas that are lighter, what you want to do is make sure that you pull the color out a little bit so you get those light spots, and then you can fill in with extra paint to end up with some of those darker areas. And I usually work over it a few times, adding a little bit more paint and more color. And I'm coming in with some purple. And with the purple, that kind of gives you those dark shadows, that dark shading that you actually do want in these. It also brings in a little bit more interest instead of just having him be all blue. And because blue and purple are on the same side of the color wheel, because blue and red do make purple, it is kind of a nice addition to this little bird. So now that I'm moving on to work on the little red robin, you'll notice that the red color that I'm using is not true to nature. As you can tell even from these birds, they're not really realistic and true to nature. And so because of that and because of like their funny eyes and their looks, I definitely wanted to go for a bird that was a little less conventional. Hence why I'm using a lot brighter red colors and trying to make them look a little bit more larger than life. You'll notice that even with the blue jay, I'm using a blue, but I'm also using purple and adding in some colors that are not totally true to nature, but still look fantastic. And so have fun with these birds. Make sure that you add things that maybe aren't totally true to nature, but are fun for you and bring you joy. I'm gonna add a little bit more burnt umber in there. Mix with some browns I already did have to make his wings at least look a little bit more realistic. And those two colors actually work well together because of the reds. There you go, I'll mute him a little bit so he's not so crazy. And move just slightly smaller brush just to get the details around the eyes, just so I don't overdo with my painting and get his white eyes all brown. Add a tiny bit of white in there. And the nice thing is you can add white on top of the paint and blend it in a little bit like that. And lastly, I'm gonna do this guy. I'm not sure what I want to do with him. I think I want to make him like a little bit crazy. Make him probably not like authentic bird colors. It's a little heavier than I wanted, so I'm just gonna try this bird instead. These bigger watercolor brushes are great for getting color down, but they do also carry a lot of water in the bristles, which is great, but it can sometimes be a little intense. And since there's so much paint in there, go back to slightly smaller brush. Some browns in there. Even super colorful birds definitely have some brown in them. I notice that when I go to the Calgary Zoo, even the male birds are bright, but they always have a little bit of brown or some other colors in them as well. So I prefer the rounds to the flats for this type of technique. I decided my colors today. We'll go a little bit brighter there. There we go. Maybe almost more of a teal color in there. I think my approach towards watercolor is just keep playing around with it until I come up with something I really like. I'm still learning a lot about color mixing, so it's not always the easiest thing to figure out how to color mix well. So it doesn't hurt to do things like this where you're kind of coloring in as practice, just to see what you can get from your paints. Okay, so I have a very light gray there that I have come up with, and that's just for doing just the bottom edges of the eye. Again, you don't want to put too much paint on because the whole point is I want to leave the eyeball fairly white, but it's nice to have a little bit of gray just to add a little bit of structure and contrast to the eye. The reason I'm coming back to it as well is just to make sure that it doesn't bleed into the color surrounding it. The moment you have bleed through in that kind of area, it's not going to help you come up with the result that you're looking for. I'm going to grab my 000 watercolor brush, and these are the ones you have to be careful of not to bend the bristles too much, because again, they're delicate. They're not the ones you want to be mixing paint with. You want to be mixing paint with your larger brushes and just applying it very gently with the smaller brushes. So she has such a bigger bill, I kind of want to be kind of orangey yellow. And maybe just give a tiny bit more personality to them. I'm just going to add a little bit of brown in the bottom here. Because I'm going to be fussy cutting around these things, you want to be able to at least have something to be able to cut around. So I always like doing them a little bit brown. Gives them a place to kind of be. I'm just going to give his little plumage a little bit of color there. And again, because I'm cutting around these, it's not a big deal that I've gone outside the lines. Again, you don't want to be just going crazy, but at the same time, it does give you a little bit of options there. So after you finish watercoloring the birds, the next thing to do is to let them dry and then fussy cut them out. So I have my 3 birds here ready to be put on the page. When I look at this, I see that it does blend in a little bit more than I was hoping for. So what I'm going to do is actually lay down some tissue paper. So I have this Tim Holtz tissue wrap. I like it because it reminds me of music, and music reminds me of songbirds. So I'm just going to take a small chunk of it. And it's not going to be perfect, but you can see that it doesn't completely cover up what's below. You can actually see through it. So I'm going to use a little bit of gloss medium and a paintbrush to tear this into strips and put it down. In this case, you just want to use like some sort of gloss or matte medium. Again, it doesn't have to be a very thick one because of the fact that you're only putting on tissue paper. Tissue paper does not need that much adhesion for it to actually stay down. Like so. The more wow, this is not ripping very well today, is it? The thicker the medium you're trying to put down, the heavier the gel needs to be. So that's why you have extra heavy gel. That's for putting down things that are like 90-pound cardstock. This stuff like tissue paper, you only really need this nice, gentle medium because it doesn't require much to get it to actually stay down. You always want to put a little bit on top as well. I usually use a palette when I'm doing this, but in this case, I'm just throwing it straight on the surface. Because of the medium from the other page has actually come across the edge here. I think what I'll do is I'll actually take it all the way to the edge and then cut off any of the excess. And that way that covers up what was from the previous page a little bit. I only care so much about it, but at the same time it's kind of nice when you can have it a little bit more consistent looking. And I'll just take a set of scissors once this is dry and just cut off the excess. And then I'm going to let this dry and then we'll come back. So now that my tissue has been adhered and it's dried, I have trimmed up the edges and now I'm going to add my birds. So now you can see they pop a little bit more because they are separated a little bit better from the background than by having just the one layer. That's what I like about having multiple layers, is it just adds that little bit of extra something just to separate the foreground from the background. So I'm just using some glue dots. It's an easy way to adhere things. Again, if you could also use a gel medium for this, you could use a few different mediums to get the job done. But I don't mind using the glue dots. They're handy. They stick quickly. I don't have to mess with them too much. So they're a good solution for me. Oh. Well, that was not planned. I moved him down low and his leg came off, but that's okay because I can just line it up nicely and you'll never know. Sometimes happens when I'm doing this stuff. I'm not always as gentle as I should be. And last of all, my third bird. So this week on my website, I actually spoke about the concept of inspiration over manipulation. It's actually something from Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, and it was actually one of the key points in that book that really stuck out to me. I really enjoy Simon Sinek's books, and especially his books on leadership, and it's not just for leadership, but it's for other things in our life as well. So the idea of inspiring people over manipulating people, whether that's in your work, whether that's in different areas of your life, I don't believe that we need to always manipulate or try to have our will on everything for us to be effective in our lives. I think we can find inspiration to be the main reason that people want to be around us and they feel inspired by us. They like what we're about. They like who we are as people. And that makes them want to follow us or even just be in our lives, right? Over having a situation where you are constantly forcing your will on other people. I honestly got really tired of that when I was working in the corporate world, where the idea of being in control was more important than relationship. And I think that's really where the inspiration for me comes in, is the idea that we don't have to manipulate people to have good relationships. We can inspire. I'm hoping even through this website, I'm inspiring you guys to do something for yourselves that is helping you. So I'm just trying inspiration over manipulation, and that's my words for this. I've seen a lot of stamps that have like little frames and text, and I'm really trying to be okay with the fact that I may not be a fan of my writing, but the only way my writing gets better is by actually using it in things. And so I'm just creating this little comment to add into my page. Make sure all my text is the same, at least similar. Actually, I think what I'm going to do is color these in a little bit. You know what? I like it without it. So I am going to instead leave the frames the way they are. And again, the whole point of this is to keep it pretty loose. This is not meant to be perfect. It's meant to be a quick journaling page to get ideas down. I've realized it's something with my art journaling that I struggle with, is just allowing things to kind of be the way they are. And I purposely chose the teal to pull the color out of the feathers on the bird. So I'm not too sure where I want to leave the letters for now, but I'm going to leave it, I think, more in the center, because I have a triangle here and your eye's coming down this way. So maybe I'll do it like so. Yeah, I think, you know what, I'm going to follow the flow of the page. So the triangle at the bottom, your eye's coming down this way, and that way you have a little bit of a stronger design. Maybe I'll just move these closer so that they look a little bit more grouped. So I have a frost blue alcohol ink marker, and I am just going to color in the background lightly. I found the white a little stark for what I'm trying to do with this page, so I'm hoping that will just give it that little bit of softness, so it kind of works with the colors I have, but it isn't completely sticking out. Yeah, so that to me like allows it to have a little bit of strength in the design, but at the same time isn't sticking out too badly. So I'm going to adhere these to the layout. Part of the reason I chose the birds is I love their expressions. I was thinking about the idea of like, how do I want to represent like inspiration or manipulation? And the looks on their faces remind me of how I feel sometimes, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Are you really acting that way? It's, you know, it really made me laugh. So I think it's one of those things of realizing that these lessons we have and these stories we have are really important, and trying to find some humor in the fact that, like, yeah, you know, this world is far from perfect, and there's some bad things that happen, but realizing that, you know, we can choose how we look at it. We can look at it as feeling like we're manipulated, or just really be inspired and choose to make a difference in this world. So there we go. So there is our art journaling project for this week. I hope that you have enjoyed this video and that you've learned a few techniques or a few different ways of using things that you possibly already have. If you have enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate if you'd like it, subscribe to my channel, and perhaps leave a comment below. Make sure that you click on the little bell to make sure that you are notified when my next video comes up. And I would love for you to check out my other videos and keep watching. I hope that you have a great week, and I'll see you next time.